Good evening. On behalf of the John J. Cali School of Music at Montclair State University, I want to welcome you to this exciting webinar, The Sound of Hope, Holocaust Music and Musicians. My name is Dr. Tamara Freeman. I am a professor of Holocaust music history, education, and performance at the John J. Cali School of Music, Montclair State University, New Jersey, and the musicologist for the International Association of Holocaust Organizations. I will be serving as the moderator this evening. Let me start by introducing our panelists who are coming to you from Johnson City, Tennessee, Brooklyn, New York, Istanbul, Turkey, and Tel Aviv, Israel. Dr. Kellie Brown is a professor of music at Milligan University and the author of The Sound of Hope, Music as Solace, Resistance, and Salvation During the Holocaust and World War II, that was just released this past summer and has been well received nationally and internationally. Sonia Beker is a retired ESL teacher from Brooklyn, New York, whose parents were talented musicians and who survived the Holocaust. Their amazing stories are captured in Sonia's book, Symphony on Fire, a story of music and spiritual resistance during the Holocaust. And from Tel Aviv, Israel, we welcome Amnon Weinstein and his son, Avshalom Weinstein. Amnon and Avshalom are violin makers who own a collection of rescued and restored violins, violas, and cellos that were played during the Holocaust. Their collection, known as Violins of Hope, brings concerts and educational events to communities all over the world. So thank you, panelists, for being with us this evening and sharing your expertise and experiences. One quick note for our viewers. There will be an opportunity to interact with the panelists following this program's conclusion. So please jot down any comments or questions that you have, and at the conclusion of this webinar, we will provide you with information about accessing a web page where you can have a post-webinar Q&A with the panelists. Let me start with you, Dr. Brown. Kellie, you have been researching music during the Holocaust for the past 15 years. Can you tell us about the genesis of your research and an overview of your new book?
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you to all of my friends who are joining me this evening. My book chronicles the stories of orchestras and composers and musicians who stubbornly clung to music wherever and however they could to preserve their culture, to uplift the human spirit, and to triumph over oppression, even amid incredible tragedy and suffering. It's organized in a narrative structure, so it's history told as story. And alongside the individual stories, there's also the stories of places, of cities, of camps, of ghettos, of concert halls, because the stories of individuals and the stories of these places are inseparable. They are interwoven and braided together. And my goal has always been to present these people's stories in a very personal and intimate way. I want to paint such a vivid portrait that readers can actually see themselves there. They can see the places, they can smell the smells, they can hear the sounds, so that they are imagining more fully what these people experienced. And so then I hope that they'll also be developing an empathy. I want readers to ask themselves what they might do in these situations, what they might do in Leningrad in the horrific siege, and it's 29 degrees below zero and there's no food or fuel, or in the Dachau concentration camp and they're made to be a human pack horse, what would they do in these situations? And I hope that readers will come away to care deeply about these people in this time and about the need for racial and social justice in the present and the future. And really, from the start, my motivation has always been to bear witness and to uphold this powerful commodity called hope. The great American poet Mary Oliver was contemplating what was the antidote to the darkness in our world. And she thought about a variety of things. And she finally landed on hope. She said, hope is a fighter. And I love that, and I believe it. And of course, in the writing and researching and reading about the Holocaust, it's such a difficult subject matter. And there's no escaping describing the atrocities, and we don't want to escape those. We have to be willing to know fully what happened. In my book, I try to balance that alongside the horrific, there's the hopeful. And I hope that I'm sort of able to lift back folds of darkness to show, these moments where grace abounds. The overarching theme of the book, it runs through it all the way, is the story of the power of music. The 19th century French novelist Victor Hugo said that music expresses that which cannot be put into words and that which cannot remain silent. And that's the whole thing. And of course, this power of music can be used in positive and destructive ways. And so for a few minutes, I want to talk about a couple of the many stories that are in my book that show music's power to bring about solace, to bring about spiritual resistance, and in some cases, salvation. And these three things are really one and the same. It's hard to separate them out. So we're going to look, first of all, at a man named Herbert Zipper. So Herbert Zipper was a really talented musician and conductor who was living in Austria. And in the early part of the 1930s, his career was taking off, but he was of Jewish descent. And so he ends up being arrested and sent to Dachau. And when he arrived, the Nazi guards were tormenting people by forcing them to sing. And when they came to Herbert Zipper and saying, be happy to be here, sing, he just burst forth with Beethoven's Ode to Joy, this message of great hope, this message of the universal mankind. And also what happened to him is that he was assigned to be a human pack horse. And he had to carry bags of cement on his back all the way through the camp. And rather than fall in despair or turn to bitterness, he saw this as an opportunity to meet people, to give a kind word, to say a poem to someone, to sing them a song. And eventually he assembled a group of musicians, and they began to give these secret concerts for the prisoners. They were giving concerts in an unused latrine, and these concerts brought such hope to the prisoners who were suffering and helped to restore some of the humanity that was being stripped from them. Another act of resistance that Herbert Zipper brought was that one day he and his friends were walking near the gate of the camp, and they saw the words over the top of the camp, Arbeit macht frei, that German phrase, work will set you free. And they knew there was no truth in that for them. And so they decided to write a song that was a parody of that. And so they wrote what became known as Dachau Song. And this song began to spread amongst the prisoners. And it was sort of this act of resistance. And then as prisoners began to be transferred to other camps, the song went with them and it spread throughout. Alma Rosé is the first person story that I learned about when I was doing my research. Alma Rosé was an incredible violinist, and she came from a very elite musical family. Her uncle was the great composer Gustav Mahler. And like Herbert Zipper, she was coming into a wonderful career as a musician in the early 1930s. And then, of course, the Third Reich took over Austria. And she's eventually sent to Auschwitz. And when she arrives in Auschwitz, this is when she discovers that there are orchestras there. And this is a photo of the men's orchestra at Auschwitz. But it wasn't an unusual thing for there to be orchestras in concentration camps. The Nazis loved to be surrounded by music. And so they forced prisoners to form musical ensembles. There were actually 3 orchestras in Auschwitz, 2 men's orchestras and a women's orchestra. And the uses of these orchestras were both for practical and for entertainment purposes. The Nazis wanted to have music in the mornings and the evenings as prisoners marched to their work detail. So they would force these prisoner ensembles to play that music. The Germans also wanted to be entertained. They wanted to be surrounded by music that they loved. So the prisoner orchestras had to give concerts for them as well. And so when Alma arrived, she was put in charge of conducting the women's orchestra. We don't have any photos of them, but we do have this drawing that shows Alma conducting the women. It was made by a fellow prisoner in Auschwitz. And what Alma realized is that she could save lives through this orchestra, because the more women she could get in the orchestra, then she could help to save them, even those who didn't have really great musical skills, because she found a way to leverage that. As long as the Nazis wanted music, then there was incentive for them to keep these musicians alive. So she could do that to help lobby for extra food rations and things that would help them. One of the people that she helped saved was Anita Lasker-Wallfisch. Anita was sent to Auschwitz when she was 17 years old. And when she was going through that horrific intake procedure, she's having her head shaved, a number tattooed on her arm. The prisoner who was doing this work asked her what she did before the war. And she said, "I played the cello." And she got a response that she didn't expect. The prisoner said, "Fantastic, you'll be saved." And she was pulled aside. And in a little while, as she stood there naked, she said a very elegant woman, a prisoner, but an elegant woman, came toward her and said, "My name is Alma Rosé." And she questioned her, "Do you play the cello?" And she said, "Yes." And Alma invited her to join the orchestra. And this was an invitation to life, because the cello did indeed save her life. She not only survived the war, but Anita is still alive today. She is 95 years old and such an amazing person. And I'll tell you briefly one other story of the many. This is about Alice Herz-Sommer. Alice was a Czech pianist. She had been a child prodigy, grew up in Prague. This is a photo of her and her young son, Rafi. When the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia, Alice's mother and Alice and Rafi and her husband were sent to Terezin. Terezin is about 30 kilometers outside of Prague. It was officially a ghetto, but it functioned as a concentration camp. And so when Alice got to Terezin, she brought music with her, and she gave over 100 piano recitals that lifted the spirits of those who were there. And she also taught piano lessons in secret to the children, even though it was forbidden to educate them. And music indeed did save Alice's life and Rafi's. Another function of Terezin was really as a transit depot, because trains were leaving all the time, deporting people to extermination camps, particularly Treblinka and Auschwitz. And Alice's mother was murdered in Treblinka. Alice's husband was sent to Auschwitz and eventually to other camps, and he did not survive. But Alice and Rafi did. And one day, a German guard, a young German, came up to her and said, "I just want you to know that I love your music. And when you play the piano, I listen outside the window. And because of that, I have made sure that you and Rafi are not on the deportation list." So Alice and Rafi did survive the war. And not only did Alice survive, but she thrived, and she lived to be 110 years old. And when she died in 2014, she was the world's oldest known Holocaust survivor. And despite the horrific things that had been done to Alice and the murder of her mother and husband and countless family members and friends, she never was bitter. And so I love this quote that Alice gave us: "Life is beautiful. You have to be thankful that we are living. Wherever you look is beauty. I know about the bad things, but I look for the good things."
Kellie, thank you so much for bringing to life and to light the lives and the legacies of these amazing musicians. Their faces say so much. Their music brought so much to other people during the war and continue to teach us so many lessons for today. Thank you. Amnon and Avshalom, your project uses the word hope in it also. Tell us about your work and how hope figures into it.
First of all, I would like to thank everybody for what you're doing. But I would like to begin with something that I didn't thought about it before, with Rafi Zomer. Rafi Zomer was my friend. We played together in the youth orchestra, in the military orchestra. So in this case, we have been together for 3 years, playing, joking together, doing everything. He was a wonderful guy. And then we played, he played the cello and the saxophone, and I played the viola and the trumpet. And I have only good memories from this guy, but we, until very late, we didn't knew anything about the resin. He didn't talk about that. That's a common thing between many survivors, even though that in the orchestra, there have been some people who survived the war. I've been there at 56, 57, so it's meaning quite fresh, we can say. And the most important thing, in the orchestra, there have been two people responsible for the musical instrument. I was for the string instrument, and then there was a guy for the wind instrument, and he was a partisan in the group of the Bielski partisan group. And nobody knew about that, even I, and nobody was thinking about, and even Rafi didn't spoke to him to share some, how to say, memories. That's very surprising, but that's life. Anyway, we are using also the word hope because the violin, the sound of the violin was a sound that accompanied the Jewish people all over the way. The sound of the violin was in the bar mitzvah, in the marriages, and the klezmer. This was a music track of the Jewish people all the time. And when they were in the ghetto or in the camps, when they're listening to the violin, they remember home, they remember the love people, they remember music, they remember the synagogue. And this was completely changing their life. And that's why we decided that the name will be Violins of Hope. And by the way, in Hebrew, hope, it's tikva. And our hymn, the Israeli hymn, it's atikva, the same thing. And that's very, very important. And I have to say that with all the concerts that we have done everywhere in the world, and there is something very, very special about it, that when we are talking about it, and the people listening to the music, when the concert are ended, you never can see a dry eyes, always wet. People are getting in and the music is doing something very special to them. And that's why we are taking care for these violins. And that's why it's so important what we are both doing, and very, very difficult, because sometimes the instruments are in very, very bad condition. Taking some instrument, you can do a restoration of 1.5 years and even more. I have some instrument here, and I hope that you can see it. If I will show on the table, it's very difficult to me to move. There is one violin with a Star of David on it. This violin was played by a guy in Auschwitz also. And it's done by a Jewish violin maker, Yaakov Zimmerman, and it's dedicated to his friend Shimon Krongold. The violin is in perfect condition, and there is a label in Yiddish for the dedication to Shimon Krongold. And the last violins that you see here, I hope so, yeah. This is another klezmer violin with 5 Star of David on it. I cannot take more than this. Here you can, if you can see, there are 4 on the upper belly, and there is on the back a beautiful Star of David. I have 2 more here. This is another Star of David violins that I'm doing exactly now, also restoration. It's in part completely, and it will be soon playing again in the concert. And this one is the most important instrument on my table and in the workshop. That's the violin of Sonia Beker, the violin of Max Beker. Now it's in the middle of the work. I hope that you can see something. And it's a beautiful Italian violin, not in very good condition anyway, because the war, of course. And it will be soon a violin to play in concert. Anyway, it will have a special label that Sonia will decide what will be written there, and we will glue it inside the violin. So we have now about 87 instruments in the collection. Most of them, we know the story. Some of them, we know that they were in the bad condition, and we don't know the story. And there is a part of the collection, violin with the Star of David, as I've shown to you too, like that, that we know 100% that they were in a Jewish hands. And if we don't know the story, some of them been in the war, of course. If we don't know the story, the dedications that we are doing is according to the restoration. When we finish the restoration of this violin, that can take from 3 months to 1.5 years, we are dedicating it for some people, for some identity, for some musician that we don't have anything rest from them. So that's in short way what we are doing. I want that Afshi will continue his speech about, because he's doing, how we are saying, half and half the work. And the new generation is much more important than us, the old generation. So Afshi, please.
So first of all, Kelly, I don't know how much you know about Anita, but her son, Raphael Wallfisch, he told me last year that when his mother arrived to the camp, to Auschwitz, she had a very special pair of sandals. And a few months later, her sister arrived, and the guy who admitted her sister looked and said, he said, I've seen these sandals before. There is one woman here in the camp who has the same type of sandals. And this is how the two sisters were again reunited. And during one of my lectures in Knoxville, a woman came to me that her mother played in the orchestra. And she told me that Alma Rosé was such a basically celebrity, because the Nazis knew exactly who she was and all her story. And she managed to get from them conditions and privileges that nobody else all over Europe had. The only barracks all over Europe which had its own toilets was the women orchestra barracks in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And all the women, I think, except one, two or three from the orchestra survived, although Alma herself didn't, of course. But this is how she managed to save them, because she made them play and work and practice all the time, but they were all saved. And when we do a project, of course, when you talk about the Holocaust, you have to talk about death. You have 6 million Jewish people who died. You have, I don't know how many, probably another 70 million all around. It's mainly death. But all those people, they always had hope that maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, maybe in a month, their war, their part will be over and they can survive. And music was one of the ways to try and bring this hope and try to keep this hope alive.
If I may, I would like to add something. In my history, there is two parts. The part that my father told me about his history and my personal history. And now I will tell you about my father. When my father was 6 or 7 years old, in the shtetl, in the little place that he was born, came a group of klezmer for a marriage of some very rich people. My father told me that this was the first time that he heard a violin in his life. All the children were coming to the marriage, of course, sitting underneath the table and stealing all the cakes they could from the table itself. My father, he told us that he was so shocked from the sound of the violin that he could not eat, he could not see, he could not drink, nothing. Now, the end of the marriage is coming after 3 days, something like that. And now my grandmother, Esther, she was looking after Moishele, my father, and nobody have seen him. And then somebody said, oh, we have seen him running after the carriage of the musician, of the klezmers. So all the Hasidim were running after. They got him on the way. They brought him back home. He got punishment for about 1 week. And in this next week, he came over to the lessons with a violin. And that's his story. And I know that many stories like this are existing, that people were catched by the sound of the violin in such a way that they wanted to play. And this was the easiest instrument in the Eastern Europe in the get. First of all, they were very cheap violins. You couldn't play a piano in the shtetl anyway. And then they've got a very special years because, first of all, Hebrew, much more. Yiddish is very, very poetic and very sounding like, we can say, a violin and the prayer in the synagogue. So that's why there was an period that all the best violins in the world, they were Jewish. And once when they asked Isaac Stern why so many Jewish are playing the violin, he said it's the easiest instrument to pick it up and to run away.
Amnon and Avshi, thank you for giving us so much insight into your family, into your beautiful work. and having experienced concerts with your Violins of Hope, I can tell you that they are unforgettable and beautiful experiences. Thank you so much. And thank you for showing
Thank
us
you.
up close Max Beker's violin, Sonia's father's violin. And that's a perfect segue to speak with Sonia next. Sonia, you have amazing connections with the Violins of Hope through your father's violin. Tell us about that violin and about your parents' stories.
Thank you so much, Tamara, for your lovely introduction. And thank you both for all your hard work in putting this amazing conversation together, and especially Kellie for her extraordinary book, The Sound of Hope, which is just gaining in popularity and success. So I first heard about Amnon in a Facebook posting about Violins of Hope. The posting talked about Amnon's work, his studio, and his mission to restore Holocaust violins, violins whose owners had lived through the Holocaust, some who had not survived. His parents had come from Vilna, my parents' hometown too, and his father was involved in Vilna's musical world, as were both my musician parents and their families. My mom, Fanya Dermashkin-Beker, was a pianist who studied at the Vilna Conservatory of Music and performed at concerts as an accompanist and soloist. Her sister, Henya, was a gifted student of opera and aspired to be an operatic singer. And her brother, Wolf Dermashkin, was the musical prodigy, pianist, composer, and conductor. Her father, Akiva Dermashkin, was the choir director of Vilna's Great Synagogue and also a liturgical composer. Many professional musicians and cantors of the time, such as Yesela Rosenblatt, came to the Dermashkin home to practice and collaborate with my grandfather and with my uncle. We were told that as people passed by on the street below, they'd stop and listen as music filled the air. My dad was a student of violin and studied at the Vilna Conservatory of Music, then played professionally in Vilna's coffee houses and concert halls. His father, Beryl, was an oboist in the Vilna Symphony, which had been conducted by my mother's brother, Wolf. My father's brother was a percussionist and another brother was a bass player. The fabric of their lives was torn when my dad was drafted into the Polish army in March 1939. On September 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland and war broke out. In June 1941, the Nazis took over Vilna. Both my parents' families were taken to the Vilna ghetto. My father's family, parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, were executed on Ponar, a killing field which had been a forest picnic ground before the war. My dad was the only family member who survived. My mother's father was also killed on Ponar. Her mother was separated from her children during a selection, and she was sent to a concentration camp. Wolf, the musical light and leader of the Vilna ghetto, was sent to Kluga, a concentration camp in Estonia, and my mother and her sister were sent to a series of concentration camps, including Stutthof, Kaiserwald, and finally Dachau and Kaufering. Only my mother and sister survived. My father was captured by the Germans and became a prisoner of war, eventually ending up at Stalag 8A in Görlitz. It was there that he joined the camp's orchestra and became its first violinist and the only Jew in the group. In this photo, you can see my father up front on the left with the camp's string orchestra. When they were liberated, my parents ended up in the same DP camp in Landsberg, Bavaria. You can see them pictured here with my mother, Fanya, on the extreme left, my dad in the center, Max, and Henya, my aunt, on the right. They became members of the camp's orchestra and called themselves the Ex-Concentration Camp Orchestra. They gave a liberation concert in May 1945 and continued to perform for the American troops, the Nuremberg judges, and other DP camps in the area. In 1948, Leonard Bernstein came to Germany to conduct the Munich Symphony Orchestra and inquired about a survivors orchestra. He was directed to the ex-concentration camp orchestra and conducted them twice in Landsberg and Feldafing. You can see Bernstein here on the far right in this photo. My mom is to his immediate right, my dad is third to his right, and my aunt is sixth to his right. My dad came to America in 1949 and my mom in 1950. They married and settled in Brooklyn, New York. That's where I was born and grew up. Although they didn't perform professionally, they played together for friends at our home and informally for their Jewish Vilna group. My mom passed away in 1998 and my dad in 2005. I put their Baldwin baby grand into storage and kept my dad's violin, his constant companion from his POW days in Germany through his escape from the POW death march to his DP days in Bavaria and then to his arrival in New York. Soon after my parents passed away, I knew I had to write a book about their journey, about how they navigated through the Holocaust as musicians, about their families, and how music was their lifeline before, during, and after the war. I called my book Symphony on Fire, a story of music and spiritual resistance during the Holocaust. It was published in 2007. I went to Vilna to research my parents' roots, find their homes, talk to Vilna's people, both Jews and non-Jews, breathe its air, and visit its Jewish monuments, buildings, park grounds, and burial grounds. I met remarkable people, made wonderful friends, saw what remained of the horror, and wept every day I was there. In 2015, I read about a program to be held at the Anne Frank Center in Lower Manhattan. Music professor Dr. James Grimes was scheduled to speak about his book, Violins of Hope, a testament to Amnon's Holocaust violins, their owners and stories, and I immediately signed up. James showed a film about Amnon and his trip to Vilna, a family odyssey as mine had been. It was then that I knew I had to give Amnon my father's violin, which I was sure he would expertly restore and then make available to be performed by Israeli and other well-known musicians at Violins of Hope concerts commemorating the Holocaust. It was a perfect next step for my father's violin. James, I was flattered to learn, had read my book and put me in touch with Amnon, and this is how the friendship among all of us began. Amnon and I continued to remain in contact. He told me more about his parents' lives in Vilna. His father, like mine, had also studied at the Vilna Conservatory of Music, and we think our fathers actually might have known each other or had the same teachers. Amnon also showed me an old poster from Vilna, advertising a concert in 1936 in which his father was a violist and my Uncle Wolf was the pianist. And so we knew our families were historically connected. Then in 2018, a talented German team, moved by my family story in my book, put together a music festival and exhibition, the Wolf Durmashkin Composition Awards, named after my uncle. It took place in Landsberg, Germany, the site of the DP camp, and my husband, cousins, and I arranged to be there. At the same time, Amnon was planning a remarkable Violins of Hope concert in Dachau. He invited me and my husband to attend, and it was there on stage in front of a full house of an enthusiastic German audience that I presented Avshalom and Asi with my father's violin. The symbolically powerful and musically excellent concert was held in a large ornate hall at the very elegant Dachau Palace, and it was with a startling sense of irony that I remembered my mother and her sister had entered the Dachau death camp just outside this very town on their way to the subcamp Kaufering in 1944. I handed Avshalom my father's violin with shaking hands and tears running down my face. It was a time-stopping moment when so many circles of meaning came together, connections of beloved family from the past, of music as a source of life, hope, and continuity, of monumental bridges built across the decades so that the dead would be honored and then give rise to new life through music. a tremendous sense of spiritual completion, gratitude, and justice filled my heart. I could ask for nothing more. A few weeks after the Dachau and Landsberg events, we were privileged to visit Amnon's studio in Tel Aviv. His violins hung carefully from the walls and shelves of the studio, waiting for the world to hear their voices, to bear witness. The studio was a sacred place, the souls of the violinists residing in their instruments, waiting to be played once again, waiting to move their audiences with their painful, heroic stories. Last year, I joined a dynamic group of music and events specialists in New Jersey. We were planning a statewide series of Violins of Hope concerts, lectures, exhibitions, and school presentations. This is where, actually, I met Tamara. Unfortunately, COVID put those plans on hold, and I hope we'll be able to reconvene soon to bring all these events to fruition. And now Amnon, as he said, has almost completed his careful, loving restoration of my dad's violin, and it will re-enter the world of music and performance. Through Violins of Hope, it will sing again and tell my father's story. No other instrument is as poignant and expressive of human emotion and the human voice as the violin. And my dad's violin, like all of Amnon's Violins of Hope collection, will be played by virtuoso violinists whose music will reach deep into their audience's hearts and minds, urging and moving them to never forget.
Sonia, thank you for sharing your family's story. The connections that they made through their music in the city of Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, run so deep and so broad. You bring honor to their memory, and you are a blessing to their memory.
Oh,
and those connections continue, don't they, through this webinar, through all of us who have come together to share these stories. And in that way, your family's legacy continues to live with pride and with dignity. Amnon, tell us more about what it was like to restore the violins played during the Holocaust, particularly Max Beker's violin. Walk us through the technical process and the emotional aspects of reconstructing and restoring these instruments.
First of all, allow me to thank Sonia for what she said. It's really unbelievable. And the violin, by the way, this is the best violins that we have in this collection because he got it in Italy, and it's Italian violin. And of course, when the violin will begin to play again, wow, I don't have the words for that. I'm sorry. I'm looking forward that it will be something very, very special. Anyway, each violin that is arriving to us is different story. It's very complicated to line up exactly what was going, because each violin was kept in another way, in another places, in horrible places. By the way, they were forced to play in rain, in very bad weather also. All these violins that have been in orchestra or in the ghetto, and there were no violin makers there to keep the violin in good condition. And if each violin has its own problem, and you need to have a lot of experience and a lot of years of working and a lot of super teachers. That's the most important, because beginning with my father and my Italian teachers and my French teachers, I learned almost everything that I could. And yet every time I have something new that nobody of my colleagues have done it before, because of the condition of the instruments. And it's difficult to point out, but usually it's coming because there was no repairmen on place, and they've had to do something they must play. They could not stop to play, because when they are stopping to play, you know what will be the end. So they've done everything in their possibilities. And first of all, I have each violin like that, I have to take it back to his original condition, to the original place that I can begin to use the original wood and to give it life again. And that's taking time. And you know, it's a very, very slowly work. It's not impossible. It's impossible to do it quickly. You have to be very careful on each step that you are doing, because the violins, they suffered a lot. And when a violin is suffering, okay, it is wood, it's not us, but the wood, you have to give him life again. And I don't want to speak about my instruments. They are speaking for themselves in the concert house. But when you are coming and playing in Berlin, orchestra, or you are playing in Cleveland Orchestra, or the other orchestras, and all the musicians are coming to you and saying, what a wonderful instrument. That's for me the best what I can have. And that's the most important, to give it back to life.
Amnon, thank you very much. And as I indicated before, I've heard your and Avshi's Violins of Hope being performed in concerts, and they resonate more than just beauty. They resonate a sanctity, a sacredness of purpose. And I thank you again, and of course your father of blessed memory, for all of the beautiful work that you have done to restore these instruments with so much love and care. The viola in my office was from Berlin. It was rescued during the Holocaust, but it was rescued in perfect condition, and it came into my hands in perfect condition. You have taken these violins, you and your family have taken the violins of hope and restored them under much more difficult circumstances. So thank you again for your beautiful work. Kellie, your book connects so many stories, including those of Sonia's parents and the history of the Violins of Hope. How did you make all of these connections, and what have these relationships meant to you personally?
Well, I'll definitely have to say that meeting and interacting with wonderful people like you, Tamara, and Sonia, and the Weinsteins, and the families of other survivors has really been one of the most fulfilling aspects of this research. And I'm so excited about these relationships and friendships that will continue in the years to come. As I said earlier, the first person story that I really learned about fully was Alma Rosé, the violinist who went to Auschwitz. And I really became completely immersed in her story. I felt like that I knew her, and I felt transported to this time. And I really don't know how to do this work except to go very deep. And so this kind of immersive approach also related to looking for resources. And I'm a great lover and collector of books, and my bookshelves at home and my office are always overflowing. I might also have piles of books in corners and places. And so I just began to really hunt for lots of resources, scholarly books and articles, but also these primary resources, diaries and letters and memoirs and musical compositions and art pieces. And I've loved the pursuit of these obscure sources from around the world that would sort of provide me the next piece of the puzzle. And in each book that I discovered, it led me to the names of other musicians whose music seemed inseparably woven into the story of their suffering. And I came to know these remarkable people like Herbert Zipper and Alice Hertzsummer. And I also came to realize that while a single book or memoir might be devoted to one of these individuals, that the connections between all of their stories that I was seeing resound through the power of music had not been collected together. And so that's how my book came to be. And it really was almost like piecing together a quilt that became stronger and more beautiful with each panel that was sewn in.
Kellie, thank you. Let me follow up with a question regarding the world today. We're living in troubling times. Why do you think it's important right now for people to be reading and learning about music during the Holocaust?
It is so important. We must keep telling these stories. We must keep naming these names. My friend Elizabeth Rosner, her father survived the Buchenwald concentration camp, and she has spent her life watching him tell his story over and over again. And she says that there's a reason that we call it bearing witness. She says that the telling of it is a physical thing. It's this living presence that is transmitted in time and sort of enters the bodies of those who are listening. Something entirely unbearable must be born and then passed on. And in that, surviving is not easy. There's an incredible weariness that comes from the responsibility to bear witness for so many years. All we have to do is to look at Anita, who survived the women's orchestra by playing the cello. When she speaks, I can see the strain on her face and in her voice from having to bear witness for 75 years about what happened to her. Her whole life has really been defined by what happened to her when she was 17 years old. And at some point in the near future, the last person on earth who lived through the Holocaust will pass, and with them this collective and visceral memory that they have held in trust for society will also pass. And so I think music specifically is one of the most accessible ways that we can tell these stories. I want to suggest that music is a living artifact, that music functions as a mirror of the time. And so when music that was written in a time and performed in a time is played again, we are transported back to that time in such a full and intense way. There's a spiritual essence to music that we've all been talking about today in this webinar, and it's so fully demonstrated through Violins of Hope and how their instruments and their music just continues to speak for those who are silent. And so I would just say again that we must keep on naming the names of the dead in order to not only keep their memory alive, but to impact the way that the living are interacting with our world, to help set the moral compass toward racial and social justice for all. We need their testimony to serve as a reminder of what hatred and prejudice can lead to, and how vital the arts remain in understanding the human condition and in spreading peace and goodness on a global scale.
Beautifully said, Kellie. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you. Sonia, you and I have a passion for teaching social justice through Holocaust music. As an educator, tell us what you think needs to be part of every child's education related to the Holocaust and why.
Thank you, Tamara. Well, before I retired as a teacher, I was already aware that in high school social studies classes, students were learning less and less about the Holocaust, its place in history and its purpose, which was the genocide of the Jewish people. The textbooks allotted only a minimal amount of space to this cataclysmic event. The result is that according to a Guardian study, almost 2/3 of American millennials and Gen Z adults between the ages of 18 and 39 they surveyed didn't know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Almost half of them couldn't name a concentration camp or ghetto. Almost a quarter of respondents said they believed the Holocaust was a myth or exaggerated. And 1 in 8 actually said they had not heard about the Holocaust at all. It is therefore quite probable that this lack of knowledge has contributed to the rise of anti-Semitism in America and the world. In the Brooklyn High School where I taught, students actually learned about the Holocaust in greater depth in their English classes, where they read Night by Elie Wiesel and The Diary of Anne Frank. In preparation for these readings, English teachers created assignments and classroom discussions based on Holocaust themes, which the students could more meaningfully internalize. Also, teachers contacted the Museum of Jewish Heritage, arranging for Holocaust survivors and young interns to come to their classes and speak to the students about this period of history. The survivors' stories were extremely powerful, and the interns, some of them third generation, who were in a similar age bracket to the students, brought slide presentations about the history of the period and presented the individual stories of young people and their families who were in the Holocaust. This kind of experiential learning is extremely effective. I believe it's important that the Holocaust be taught as a unit in itself under the banner of social justice. The Holocaust was an extremely heinous example in recent history of genocide and its immorality, of human suffering in the extreme, perpetrated by one group who believed itself superior to another. First, an historical foundation should be established with lessons about the history of the Jewish people, their diaspora from Israel and the Middle East, and entry into different world societies. Then the unit could focus on Europe and Eastern Europe, where many Jews settled and experienced periods of both prosperity and persecution, and why. This could then segue into the conditions, political, psychological, and sociological, leading to the Holocaust. It would also be imperative to present the influence of Jewish law on our Western legal system and other Jewish contributions to Western society, literature, music, science, and technology, both pre and post-war. This unit could also contain reading assignments of Holocaust literature and viewing films on the subject, as well as guest speakers and presentations such as those I mentioned. Kellie's excellent book, The Sound of Hope, would be a valuable resource, as could my book. In the classroom, students could form groups and be given topics and role play to discuss and present. At home, research papers could be given as assignments. Ultimately, a visit to the Museum of Jewish Heritage would be beneficial as well. In this context, the Jewish people could be viewed as a social group that, despite its suffering and continuous historical efforts towards its genocide, has survived, flourished, and contributed to the world. The how and why of Jewish survival can be analyzed and discussed, and the story of the Jewish people can thereby be an inspiration to others. As part of the social justice theme, students could also be taught other similarly constructed historical units focusing on the genocide of other peoples, such as Rwanda and the history of American slavery. It's important that through this learning experience, stereotypes are disproved and our human connection is emphasized.
Thank you, Sonia. You've given us a lot to think about and some actionable ideas as educators. I have no doubt that your book and Kellie's book would add a lot to curricular work for teachers of all ages, and particularly at the college level. And I've used the Violins of Hope book by James Grimes in my own work. Thank you very much. We're coming quickly to the end of our webinar, but I really want to give Amnon and Avshi just a moment or two to talk a little bit more about what's happening with your instruments right now in the Violins of Hope. I know many things are on hold right now for the Violins of Hope because of the pandemic. Once our world becomes safer, and hopefully that will be soon, what are your plans?
First of
Well,
all the violins are now in the workshop, and there's not big place to move here. And every week we have another questioning, another interviewing, another things that people want to do. We have had now a beautiful, beautiful conversation with a French television about a guy that he was righteous of the nation. And the story is something unbelievable in France. And they've done a beautiful story with him. And I think that the best is that Avshi will tell you all what is going on, because he is responsible for the continuation and the new things that are coming all the time. And I think that he has to say it. So he knows much better than me in this case.
so hopefully we can start working soon if the rumors and the facts about the vaccination are true. We're scheduled to be already now in a few places, but of course, as you can imagine, nothing can happen for the next 3 months. We hope to start again in April with something in San Francisco and Guadeloupe, the French island, and the very big project starting in July in Richmond, Virginia. And then we are scheduled, basically almost fully scheduled until 2025, with maybe a few short windows. But unfortunately, right now, it's very difficult. It's also, these projects are very complicated. They're usually very big, which makes them also very expensive because there are lots of things involved. And as you can imagine, raising money right now in this atmosphere, it's not a very easy thing. But yeah, if things go back to some kind of normality and we can have concerts again, we are going to be very, very busy for hopefully a very long time. There are all the time more and more places who wants to do projects. I don't really have time for all of them. We are trying to squeeze here and there. But we have to wait now, like everybody else. We're simply waiting.
Thank you, Avshi. Thank you, Amnon. And it's we will wait patiently, but also impatiently for that day to come when the violins of hope can travel around the world once again. We're at the end of our webinar now, and I personally want to thank my colleague at Montclair State University, Dr. Kate Timoni, a religious studies professor who has helped make this possible. Thank you so much, Dr. Timoni. And thank you, Kellie, Amnon, Avshalom, and Sonia, for this informative and inspiring discussion. And thank you to all of our viewers for joining us. I hope that this webinar has made you want to know more about the music and musicians of the Holocaust. You can read so many stories of the power of music in Dr. Brown's new book, The Sound of Hope. It is available in print and ebook formats from your favorite online book retailer. We also encourage you to buy from an independent bookstore in your area or from one via an online order. Our independent bookstores are treasures and we need to support them. To keep up to date on the work and schedule for Violins of Hope, visit www.violinsofhope.com. You can also follow Violins of Hope and Dr. Brown's book, The Sound of Hope, on Facebook and other social media formats. As I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, because of the time zone differences, this webinar you are watching was filmed earlier. Our panelists are eager to interact with you now. If you have questions or comments, We invite you to click on the link on this live streaming page, which will direct you to the Cali School of Music YouTube page, where we can interact in the comments section. We look forward to continuing our discussion with you there for the next 30 minutes. Thank you again for attending, and good night.